All right, I wanted to know, let me change out of sharing. I want to know if you can guess what is being depicted in this image behind me. What do you think? I have this image up for a reason today. I always do, like there's always a purpose behind why I have that background, but what does that look like to you? What do you think that is showing? Any guesses? It's a super famous piece of art. Is it a person slipping on a banana? Very close. It is a person. It does look like they're falling, like right about there, right? Like there's, whoa. Yeah, it's called Nude Descending a Staircase. So it's supposed to look like a figure who's walking downstairs. I think you can kind of see that if you look here. Obviously the figure isn't realistic. It's you know, supposed to show them in motion, like a stop motion situation. And this is an example of modernist art. And the reason I have it up here is because it's really going to inform our discussion today of modern poetry and what modernists in general we're trying to do. So I want to go through that with you today and talk about that. Also today, maybe we should take care of this first. I wanted to talk about the exam review because last time I took some time out to talk about how to search in JSTOR, which is valuable and I don't regret it, but we never got to talk about the study guide. And I even put a post-it on my attendance form right here. I said, don't forget to go over the exam study guide with 2B. So the study guide is available in Blackboard and it's also linked here on the calendar. So I just want to go through that briefly with you and then we'll get back to the banana guy. And do some notes for today. So just a reminder that the final exam is coming up. It starts on May 10th and you have between May 10th and May 13th to complete it. It is not timed, just like the midterm. It's pretty much set up like the midterm, although I reduced the number of questions. The reason that I did that is because people were taking forever to take the exam, like 12 hours, 14 hours. And I'm like, oh, I hope they took a nap or something in between there. And, you know, the idea isn't that you're spending forever doing the exam. The idea is that you already know stuff and you're just typing it in on the exam. So I get the feeling that some people are like, let me go and look that up. Let me go and look that up. Well, you know, you're either going to study it as we go through it in the term, or you're going to have to do it all at the end. And, you know, we've been going through it piece by piece. So I don't know. I guess I feel like don't complain at the end if you have to go back and look at everything if you haven't been reading and keeping up with stuff. I don't know if y'all have or not. In any case, so I reduced the number of questions to 12 questions. There will be 10 short answer questions and 2 essays. So I put the point values there. So maybe be less time consuming. I don't know. I have to go with their test that they created in the department. This is kind of really cutting it down, but I think we're all at that point where, you know, less for you to do, more, you know, I'm sure it will be comprehensive and cover all the time periods since the midterm, but I also have to read them all. So then after that, you have the different units, right? So we have to finish the end of unit 3 after the midterm with Gulliver's Travels. So what I did was I put in here the background material and the textbook where you can find that, the slideshow that I used to introduce that material. And then these are all the concepts. So I don't know if you remember from the midterm or not, but all the terms that I put here under each section, because it's set up the same way for each unit, these are the ones that are in the database that you could get on your exam for those short answers or the essays. So for example, it's just going to spit out 10 different terms from the different time periods, and then you have to connect that term to a piece of literature and then explain how it connects to that piece of literature. So I've already put all those ones that you could possibly get here on the study guide. So I already went into the test and put them in here. So if you study these things about that time period, look over the slide deck, you know, you can review the videos. I put the videos from the different class periods, the different lectures in here, but they're from first period because you can go back and look at your period too if you want in the YouTube playlist. But I thought it'd be good to have a link to me talking about those different things in case you wanted to go and put them on double speed or something and review. But they're all from first period because I just couldn't, it seemed kind of redundant to just put in for each class period their particular thing when it's the same material. So then the romantic period, same thing. Here are the terms that you need to study because these are the ones that are going to pop out on the test. Here's the background material. Here are the different lectures and study guides, and then the Victorians, same setup. And then the modern era. Now the modern era, I haven't put all the links in here because I'm still finishing that up today with the poetry and then next week with 2 pieces of fiction. So I'll put that stuff in there as it happens, but I can't put it in there yet. But the terms are here. So if you start reviewing the terminology and all that stuff next Thursday, we'll be wrapping up our last piece of literature. Friday, if necessary, we can, talk about any of the terminology, how you would write about it, how you would connect it on the exam to a piece of literature, and so on. Or Thursday, I'll ask you, do you want to have that class period? Because I don't know, maybe sometimes it's good to sit with the instructor and kind of like point out things that you want to hear them review. And sometimes it's better just like, I'd rather have the time to just review myself and I don't want to go to class. So I'll ask you next Thursday how you feel about that. But that will be our last class meeting. After that, it's up to you to do the exam. And my grades are due on the 17th to STC. So any questions about how that works out or any questions from the study guide? Any questions? Okay, I just wanted to go back and do that because I realized after we dismissed class on Tuesday that I had never even gone over that study guide with you. You can also find it in, let me go to the student view. The study guide is also here in Blackboard under final exam study guide right here. So you can access it there as well. All right, I don't see any questions in the chatteroo. So let me go to some background. So today our focus is looking at modernist and postmodernist English literature. If you think about the 20th century, we basically break it in half. And the first half of the 20th century we call kind of modernism. And then the second half of the 20th century, we call it postmodernism. There's going to be a question, I'm sure, in the next 30, 40 years about the beginning part of the 21st century, whether it starts to form its own new thing or whether it's still part of the postmodernist movement. You can only decide those things at the, like looking back. So the idea is that we don't know right now if we're in an extension of postmodernism or if we're moving into something new. But that's the cool thing about contemporary literature is you can read it and go, that's different. And then it's about whether future people will look back and say it's different enough that it wasn't postmodern anymore. And it was something new that they want to call it, 21st century literature or whatever. So I included this image and you see it behind me and you also see it on the screen here because this is a painting that I think really accurately represents the concept of modernism. This is from a painting that was done in the early teens, 1917, 1920, something like that, by Marcel Duchamp, who was a French painter. But the reason that this one is significant is because it demonstrates a whole new approach to art. Lots of people look at modern art and they're like, I don't see it, or my kid could do that, or it's just a blob, or like whatever. And when we talk about modernism, we can extend it, to all creative things in that time period at the first half of the 20th century. So poetry, literature, art, music, everything is kind of shifting. This is where we have jazz starting to make a point, totally different kind of music, right? It's American, so we don't really dwell on it in British literature, but the idea is that all of the creative people, writers, artists kind of had this new viewpoint of make it new was their catchphrase. So they wanted to completely break from the traditional aspects of Victorian writing, that romantic writing, that overdone stuff. We want to make it, we're going into a new century. We're going to make it new and fresh, and we're not going to do that old grandpa stuff anymore. Of course, now that's old grandpa stuff to us, but the idea is that every time period kind of wants to do things in a new way. We don't like the music of, this time period anymore, so we're going to change it up, and now we're going to have pop music, or now we're going to, have rap, or we're going to have, R&B, whatever. So it's always evolving, and that's kind of what this picture represents, right? If this is a figure going down a staircase, right? I think I can click here and get to another image on the screen of it. If this is a picture of a naked person walking down, it's a series, so this is a part of it, walking down a staircase, lots of people will look at that and go, no. But you can see the representation of the human, and you can see the movement that he's trying to depict, and all that is new in art. If you wanted to see a person walking down a staircase in a painting in Victorian times, it was literally a person walking down a staircase, and you wouldn't have any trouble looking at it. So it's all because the movements are toward this abstraction, this something different that nobody's ever seen before. So where we start to see like free verse poetry, because people are trying out new things. It's sort of experimental. So I made this background here. You can find it also in the additional materials in Blackboard if you just want to make a copy of it for yourself. But when we're talking about modernism, one important movement is imagism. And I put a note of it right here. We're going to look at a couple of imagist poems today. But that was a new thing too. The poems in the Victorian times and the Romantics are long, sometimes several pages. Think about Byron. I mean, Byron wrote some poems that are 75 pages long. And so the imagists said, well, if I'm going to make that new, it has to be completely different. And so they wrote like 2-line poems where it was just a moment. I really like the way one of my college instructors put it. And she said, Imagist poetry is like if you're in a room and there's a doorway to another room, and that the door opens slightly, and you can look in there and see, but then the door closes. And so you only get that little glimpse, and that's Imagist poetry. Nothing like that ever existed before. The modernists invented that because they're trying to break from that traditional aspect. So the beginning part of the modernist movement, I hope that made you laugh because I just crossed my eyes. The beginning of the modernist movement is kind of fun and cool and different in that way. But then World War II came, and everybody got real cynical and dark, and thought about the horrors of the war and life, like I was talking about on Tuesday. About halfway through the century, though, after World War II, we move into a distinctly different time period, and that's the postmodernist. It's kind of easy to remember that because post means after. So the second half of the 20th century focuses more on social change, gaining knowledge, looking at things through different lenses. We've been studying critical lenses pretty much all year, off and on. And that's when critical lenses really came about, where people started to say, Shakespeare was writing in his time, but we could look back on it now in this way through like psychology, or we could go back and look at Milton in terms of, feminist studies. And so critical lenses came to the forefront in postmodern times because we started to realize that we can look at literature in more than one way. And so it's more three-dimensional than we thought. And we can look at it in terms of culture, background, etc. Postmodernists also are interested in the literature of political change, You can think of the 1960s, right? All of the protests that people were doing. Even now, people still protest. That really wasn't a thing very much before the second half of the 20th century. And so literature's supporting that social movement. There's a concern over single narratives and like universal approaches to morality and things like that. In other words, until the 20th century, most of British literature was sort of centered on the male viewpoint, the white male viewpoint, and the Christian viewpoint. Whereas there are lots of religions in the world, and now that there's been immigration into Britain since the Victorian times, there are new voices, and there are people who don't have that same kind of narrow scope on the world. And so postmodernists are interested in looking at, you know, not one view of the world, but multiple views of the world. And so they look at art and history and culture in that way. So we kind of still do that today, and contemporary literature is still doing that, but not in the same ways that they did in the second half of the 20th century. So I'll be anxious when I'm old and gray to see if they look back on, the early 2000s and say, it was something else. But any questions on this or why this painting is here? You could probably guess I was an art minor in school. I like to throw in some art to be more visual, and in my classroom, I like to have the wall and all that stuff. All right, I want to go through some poems then. You can get a copy of the poetry pack here. There are maybe 6 poems that I want to go through today, and they're shorter because modernist and postmodernist, right? Like, keep it simple. So if you want your own PDF, you can open it there. I'm going to open, did I close it? I did close it. Let me go to Cami. I've already annotated mine so that I can go through them. So let's look at some of those examples. Let's look at some of those elements in poetry. It's kind of weird to pick 5 or 6 poems from 100 years and say, oh, these are the ones that, yeah, is this one? These are the years that we had the poems that represent all these different ideas, but this is like a survey class, so. All right, so the first couple here are Imagist poems, and you could see Ezra Pound was American, but he was very influential in the Imagist movement, and I wanted to show you this one. This is the most famous Imagist poem of all. It's called In a Station of the Metro. So he's at the train station, and he writes this, snapshot poem, this one image. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So it's a metaphor comparing the faces in the crowd to petals that are sort of stuck to a branch of a tree. That's very different from Victorian poetry. And I'm hoping that you can see that, because they consciously said, we need to break from all that and do something different. And that's the excitement of modernist works. Here's another one, James Joyce, who was from the UK. And it's just a poem about a flower that he gave to his daughter in her hands. It says, frail the white rose, and frail are her hands that gave, whose soul is sear and paler than time's wan wave. Rose frail and fair, yet frailest, a wonder wild, in gentle eyes thou veilest my blue-veined child. So it's about her hands as she's holding this flower. It does have rhyme, so it's hearkening a little bit back to some ideas of previous poetry, but the image is just that one image. And also he's inventing words like rose frail. So all that demonstrates the modernist movement. From the textbook, we can see in The Glory of Women, the horrors of war. Siegfried Sassoon was a soldier in World War I. And you can see that this was published in 1918. And this poem is about, it's kind of an angry poem, because it's about how people who don't go to war think that they know what war is, and they value the valor of soldiers. They worship decorations. You love us when we're heroes, it says. But the things that you worship about soldiers represent different things to the soldiers. In other words, if I'm wearing these decorations, it means that I survived a horror and that I had to withstand seeing people, mangled around me. And so the second half of the poem kind of flushes that out. And so there's a conflict between what society wants to see of soldiers and what it's really like to be a soldier and how horrific that is. He says, you make us shells. And I don't know what the footnote says on that. I don't know, did I include the footnote? But there were people who had to go into factories and literally make the ammunition, the shells that go into the mechanized machine. There were a lot of machines of war in World War I. That's why it was such a gruesome war, because now you've got howitzers and other types of like machine guns are invented for the first time in that war. And so when he says you make us shells, literally people who were back home went into the factories and they changed making whatever they were making in that factory into making ammunition. You probably already know that from your history class, but that line can also be read like you turn us into shells of people. Like you turn us into someone who is just an image of, a soldier in his dress uniform with his medals on. But there's so much more to what happened in the war. So there's like a double meaning with that line. He says, you can't believe that British troops retire or retreat when hell's last horror breaks them and they run, trampling the terrible corpses, blind with blood. So he's sort of angry that society is idealizing the role of the soldier without understanding the realities of being a soldier. You get that final image. Oh, German mother dreaming by the fire while you are knitting socks to send your son. His face is trodden deeper in the mud. He's already dead. Not super uplifting poem. So this one demonstrates the qualities of the effect of World War I on writers directly, because Siegfried Sassoon was a soldier in World War I. World War I. Here's some Yeats. Yeats can be tough sometimes, but this one is sort of a downer too. It's called When You Are Old. It's not nice to think about when you're old. I mean, like, it's going to be nice in some ways, like if you're a grandparent, but like, it's just sort of one of those things you have to accept. This poem is about the passing of life and the passing of love, and how when you're old, you'll look back on the memories that you have. And, it doesn't even say that those memories will make you happy. It just says you'll remember them and how you lived your life, basically. So there's this sadness that exists here in this poem because that's the time period. Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night represents a shift into postmodernism. Dylan Thomas was writing in the 1950s, and so this poem has a different twist to it. This poem is about not giving up, and it's a VNL. The structure, we haven't seen VNLs. VNLs are more of a modern and postmodern format for poetry. It's a newer type. But you can see that the same lines are repeated many times throughout the poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. And then rage, rage against the dying of the light. So the night comes to represent death or giving up hope, and light comes to represent life and hanging on to hope. So we have that shift into postmodernism where he's urging people to continue fighting even though life has its moments of despair, to keep pushing through and keep trying. And you should rage, rage against the dying of the light. So like we were talking before class really started about the idea of people having an overly positive, almost annoying perspective on things these days. And I think this poem kind of goes with that, because they're acknowledging that there is night and there is darkness, but it's sort of like try your hardest to find something good in it, right? Like, I acknowledge that things are dark, but just instead of cheer up, be happy, smile, it's like I acknowledge that most of life is troubling, but try not to give up that spark of life, that spark of hope that you have and that exists in you. And so this poem, I think, is, good for these times that we're living in right now too. It's generally about death, and it's mainly about his father, because he talks about wise men, good men, wild men, grave men in general, but then the final stanza says, and you, my father, do not go gentle into that good night. He doesn't want his dad to die. So that poem has levels. The last poem for today is Blackberry Picking by Seamus Haney. This one was written, I think, in the 1980s. Does it have a date on it? No. I don't know, I have to go back and check on that, but during Seamus Haney's life, obviously. And this one is similar to Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night in that modernist viewpoint, because it's about how we should try to maintain hope amid all of the grim realizations of life. And it's narrative. This poem is more narrative than the other ones that we've looked at. It's a story about how it's a remembrance. He's remembering when he was a kid, how in August the blackberries would ripen and you could go and get them and eat them like candy, basically. And the kids would always go out and they would get every container that they possibly could find, and they would load up on all these ripe blackberries, and they would get overzealous and even pick the ones that weren't ripe. And they would just pick every blackberry that they could find, whether it was ready or not. And so there's this description of how eager they were to do all of that. And then the second stanza is about what happens because they overindulge and they have way too many berries. It rots. It rots before they can eat it all. And so they put it in the barn, and then what happens is a fungus takes over, the juice ferments, and they can't eat them. So it's a metaphor, parable for being more wise and only taking what you need. But you also have this final line: I always felt like crying. It wasn't fair that all the lovely canfuls smelt of rot. Each year I hoped they'd keep, knew they would not. So, but each year they go out and they pick again. And so there's that hope that things will be different. They should just learn their lesson, right, as kids, and maybe pick less and leave the green ones on the bushes so they can go out next week and get some more blackberries that are fresh and not rotted. But it's that idea that they're still hopeful about going out and each year and still getting the blackberries and remembering that. There are some foreshadowing elements in the first part of the poem where you have words like clot. That's not a, like, here, eat this clot. That's not a very pleasant image. If it's a berry, that's one thing, but he calls it a clot. He compares it to summer's blood and a lust for picking, which sounds like sort of overkill. They get scratched trying to go and get all these, and then there's blobs, and then he compares their hands, which would get sticky because of the juice and the dark, and they get stained because they've been picking all these blackberries, and then that's compared to Bluebeard. And Bluebeard, in fiction and maybe in real life, killed his wife. And so there are little hints in the top part of the poem about the disappointment that's going to come in the second, after the shift of the poem here. Just like we see in postmodern work, right? Like, let's try to keep our hope alive, but it's tough. It's a tough thing to do. Are there any questions? I went through these kind of quickly, but I'm hoping that you can see the qualities of these modern and postmodern elements in the poetry. We'll look for it again in the two pieces that I have for you next week. Next week, we're going to read 2 pieces of short fiction and apply modernist ideas to them. All right, last question then is, how are we doing with the paper? This is the final exam thing, but how are we doing with paper number 2? It is due on Tuesday. I've been reading people's drafts. I've been looking at people's first paragraphs. People have been emailing me. These are the sources I have so far. Can you help me find another one? I've been, whoever contacts me, I've been working to try to help them with whatever they might need. So are there any questions? How's it coming with your essay? Anything you want me to talk about? Having a hard time finding good sources? Well, shoot me your thesis and let me know what you already have. I can do some searching for you. I think that, there are 3 really good sources right here on the research paper document. One is JSTOR, and you have to have 3 JSTOR articles out of the 5. They could all be JSTOR articles, but at least 3 of them need to be JSTOR because we have to prove to the English department at STC that you know how to use JSTOR. But you can also use Voice of the Shuttle, depending on what period you're working from. Even if you're not doing a period, if you're not doing, like option 1, you could still say, oh, well, Milton is from the 17th century, so let me go and look in that one. And then you could get these guides that will help you with more research. And then there's also Project Muse. I think Project Muse is a little harder to use, but it's another resource. So these are online sources that will give you scholarly stuff. And then JSTOR is here. On Tuesday, I went through that whole description of how to search on JSTOR. But yeah, I've been helping people for the last couple of weeks who are working on their papers find more sources. So like if your sources, if you already have them, but they're kind of like, I don't know if I can make this work in my paper, maybe send me your thesis and I will see what I can find and send back to you some ideas. Yeah. It takes some practice to find articles, or sometimes you realize you have to refine your thesis. But I would start with these. And then if you've been through the JSTOR search and it's frustrating you, then just drop me a line and I'll see what I can do to help you. But yeah, those finals are due Tuesday on a pretty strict timeline from here on out, because I have to grade the midterms, the finals too. That's all written, so it takes a while to look through them. All right. Anything else you can think of that you'd like to spend some time talking about today? This week's discussion is on the importance of being earnest. It's going to ask you to compare and contrast the satire in that piece to the satire in Gulliver's Travels. We talked about that on Tuesday. Probably end up with more contrast than comparisons. All right, next week gets a little jammed up because responses for discussion 9 are due. That's the last discussion. And the essay number 2 is due on Tuesday. Some people have already turned it in. So I've already graded maybe 3 of them. And also we're going to talk about the story, The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf. That one is pretty short. I think it's maybe 4 pages. I tried to pick short ones. The garden party is a little bit longer, but that's for next week. And then if we need review time, and then just the exam. All right, I don't see anything else in the chat. So if anything pops up, just send me an email. I appreciate you guys coming to class. I think it's the best way to stay on top of things and have opportunities to ask questions and all that stuff. So I'm glad that you're here for that. All right, well, I will see you next in class on Tuesday. And if something in the meantime would help you, just let me know. Okay? Have a good day. Enjoy your weekend. Bye. Bye, Josh. Hey, Sean, what's up?